So, welcome everybody. Welcome to our first paper session. Thank you very much for your patience. We have 3 papers for you for this first session. And our first speaker is Jason Palamara. Jason is an assistant professor of music technology at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And Jason's talk is Morphone templates for machine learning enabled music performance. And just a trivial point, Jason spent 13 hours at Charles de Gaulle Airport. So well done for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yes, this will be delivered on 3 hours of sleep after 40 hours in airports, but thank you, Mark and Dave and everyone else for helping out with all of this and for getting it to this point. So just a word of introduction to what I'm working on. So I'm talking about a term that's when I first came across it, I Googled it just to see, well, who else is using this term? Where are they getting this? Morphone. And the term, as far as I could tell, has not been written about by anyone or really used. And so I thought I would actually delve into that term and see whether it actually had any bearing on my own work. So that's the sort of the background of the paper. So my work is I'm a composer, but I'm also a person who works with machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's an extremely wide field, as I'm sure you know. There's room for everybody in AI circles. So at least that's the way I feel. But there's a pretty serious division between people who are working on the generative sort of symbolic side and the people who are working on the analysis side. So I like to think of it as there's machine learning and there's deep learning and there's also artificial intelligence, and what I'm really working on is artificial intelligence. And if you speak to people who are in the sciences and you say something about artificial intelligence, they say that's a bad term, don't use that. And I say, no, it is a good term. It's a philosophical difference, but that's where we are. But the thing that I'm always working on is what I refer to as machine learning enabled performance technologies. So this is when you the deep learning side, they're usually using very strong, or very powerful computers to do analysis of real audio and sort of like using that to there's sort of like 3 sources of funding. There's the figure out if you can heal people with machine learning. There's the figure out if you can kill people with machine learning, or figure out if you can manipulate them into buying something. And then there's music on the other side. So it's like so a lot of times the machine learning that we use on the musical side is a little bit behind the times, and that's because those 3 sources of funding are not quite there, because I don't want my music to kill people or manipulate them in any way. But that's fine. That's a statement for another day probably. But machine learning enabled performance technologies. So really this is tied to performance, to like making applications that you can use in correspondence with like live performers. So this is sort of along the lines of, if you know the work of Gil Weinberg, who builds robots that play marimba. He also does work with prosthesis. So so robotic arms that drummers can use after they have an amputation or something of that nature. So it's in that realm. We always want the systems that we build to be responsive and alive, so that when you do something on the stage, when if you change the tempo slightly, the machine reacts. If you change your volume, the machine will listen to that and respond accordingly. And so there's a lot of machine learning, but there's also just a lot of sort of like simple musical ideas that because at the end of the day the machine has to understand music in the same way that a human does. That's what we're really after. It's artificial musical intelligence, right? So with my colleague Scott Deal at IUPUI, and it is one university. Mark was asking me about that. It's an extremely long name for a university, but Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. It's a Jeopardy question at some point. Scott and I started working on this project in 2017. And the idea was that basically like he would be the performer, I would be the coder, and I'm also a composer myself. He's a composer himself, but he likes to improvise, and the idea we originally had, and this is why we called the project Avatar, is that we wanted to actually like create a model not of some long dead composer, Bach, Mozart, something like that. We thought that's great, to come up with a model of a long dead composer who left a bunch of pieces behind, because you have all of their works and you can do a lot of machine learning on that. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we could actually like make a model of Scott? Scott is a composer himself. We have access to all of Scott's pieces, and I think, so we've made a model of Scott's work. We've made a model of my own work. We've done a couple other people, and we've specifically tried to find people who are around, still working, alive. And I think that going forward, the idea is that this would actually be kind of, this would be kind of an artifact that you leave behind. It's not really you. As the musical avatar is not Scott. It won't make his jokes and play like him, but it's sort of the same thing, long after he and I are gone, this thing will still exist, and you can interact with it in some way. So that's what we're up to, but it still has to interact in a live fashion. So so this is another side note. This will get us into the paper. I teach a music and artificial intelligence class at IUPUI, and one of my undergrads did a project on an application called Dynascore. So I'll show you Dynascore here. Where did it go? Okay, so Dynascore. It's a dinosaur. So he did this presentation on a new app. I had never heard of this before he brought this up. This is Dynascore. And the idea behind this app is kind of ingenious, and you can kind of see where they're going with trying to fund it. Maybe I'll make it a little bigger. Maybe you can see it better there. So the idea is that this is a sort of algorithmic composer using machine learning for video and visual media. So if you were doing a car commercial, for instance, and the car commercial is like 1 minute long, and you have certain emotional hit points along the way, there's that manipulate people into buying things again, but so you have certain emotional hit points that you want, and you want it to climax at a certain point and then end, right? And you want to give it a certain mood. So if I can go back. So you start off here, you say you're doing an adventure film, you just type in adventure film, and it gives you all of these sort of like, like stems almost, so I have no idea what this is. This is Rat Pack. See what Rat Pack's So this actually, because these are actually composed by real composers, you can see that this actually could at some point be like a revenue stream for someone if this really took off, because they have actual composers putting in their stems, and they're just sitting in their apartment saying, adventure film, okay, boom, I'll like crank out a 2-minute adventure film score for nothing, But then using Dynascore, and this is the trick of why this app is kind of cool, is that here's the original tune, and we just heard a bunch of it. But let's say we want it to be a duration of 1 minute. So this may not work, but let's say we wanted to move our. We'll do this here. Oh, there we go. We wanted to move a climax right there, so that lines up with my video. So I figure out where my video is, and it's like this happens there, this happens there, right? And I want to, let's say, have another one here. Maybe there's sort of a lull, something like that. That's the sort of the emotional roller coaster of this piece. Okay. We hit hatch track. Oh, okay. We'll call this NoiseFloor. The NoiseFloor track. Okay, so it's not going to work, unfortunately. So what it does then is it actually takes the track, pulls out the important parts of it, right? Because as you're composing it, you put in the stems, right? And it says, okay, so this is the drum beat, this is the hook, this is the bass line, and it reconfigures it to match this emotional roller coaster, and it does it quite well. I wish I could get it to work there. So but I thought, wow, what an interesting concept, I mean, that's a pretty neat concept, and you can do this all day long. You like that track, great. You put it in your video. You don't like it, whatever, it goes away. So as I started looking into this, the student I was talking to, as I started asking, how do they actually pull out these things? What's the criteria for that? Because the machine learning side is pretty easy, because you can sort of imagine how they accumulate a bunch of musical hit points together, and then how you figure that out. But I said, what's the criteria for actually figuring out what the important things are in the piece? Because that's where the intelligence comes from. That's the sort of when I started thinking about it, I go, wow, that would be what I would really have to spend a lot of time figuring out, is that, how do you get the machine to understand? Because you don't want some human to have to sit there and say, oh, because if you could do that, I mean, I might as well just compose the piece myself. You want the machine to quickly recompose the piece. And that's when, so I emailed the president of the company, of course, Peter Lehrman, and I got this response. I even told him I would be writing a paper about this, so he was excited about that. So he used this word morphone, okay, and I specifically said, what is a morphone? Because in some of his interviews he had referred to this term morphone, and I immediately Googled it. I was like, I have never heard that word in my life. It sounds like morpheme, which is a word that they use in linguistics. Morphone. So he says morphone is a word we came up with. So there's the answer. They just coined it themselves. To describe one of the core components of Dynascore, it's the musical equivalent of a linguistic morpheme, and it's a portmanteau of morpheme and stereophone. I don't think stereophone is as important in this, but sort of adding the suffix phone to it sort of changes it to be about sound. The available verbiage, note, event, MIDI event, phrase, cell, figure, motif, each of these came up short to describe the smallest musical unit that carries significance. Since sometimes, and this is interesting, he says sometimes a single note can carry, a single note such as a sonically significant drum stroke can legitimately be considered a morphone. On the flip side, you could, in theory, have multiple motifs inside one morphone. And that's a really interesting point, and I think he's right about that. Many times, you do hear, I mean, we can all probably go to your, mind palace and come up with a number of such moments in music where something is just a note, and it's just so powerful, that one note being in that spot. And I thought, this really still doesn't tell me much, And I think also that the word morphone is a bit of a, I think, a dodge, by coming up with the word morphone. He's sort of saying, it's magic. We don't, But I started thinking, he didn't kind of want to tell me how it was actually, because he knows that I'm a computer science guy myself, and I'm like, what's going on here? What are you doing? What's your algorithm? So I started thinking about it from a musical perspective. Everything for me always goes back to, when you're thinking about how music is made, I kind of go back to like sort of basic music theory. So, we divide, and there's a bunch of different ways. I mean, if you read any music theory textbook, there's a bunch of different ways you can sort of start off by saying, how do we understand music, at its roots? But something that has always kind of resonated with me is the idea of pitch, intensity, rhythm, and timbre. There's a lot more to music, but if you get those four things, if I put those four things, if I make a computer patch that does those four things in some kind of, regular repeating way, you'll think it's music. So pitch, intensity, rhythm, timbre. You can also swap out words like, pitch, frequency, then we also have things like pitch is divided into sort of like two musical uses of it, which is, melody or harmony. And those words, they have a lot of cultural baggage. So harmony has a ton of cultural baggage. So sometimes you might substitute the word simultaneity or cluster or something like that. But it's also important to note that if you start to go down that route and say simultaneity, you're also losing the idea of there being a function, which is why we adhered the baggage to the word harmony in the first place. So it's a trade-off no matter what you do. So all of those terms can be parsed a million different ways. But suffice to say, pitch, intensity, duration, rhythm, and timbre. From there, let's say we focus on anything like let's say duration. So from the form we have a section of music. So let me play a section of music here. I hope this isn't too loud. Oops, let me change to string scaler. Okay. Let me make it louder.
I got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you. Got my mind set on you. But it's gonna take money.
So, if you think about the drum beats of this song, this is George Harrison. I've got my mind set on you. It's a great song. If you think about the drum beat, it's very repetitive. So if I go to, there's my slides here. So if the drummer is doing 8 bars of this, happens later in the song, around the bridge, it does this exactly. It's repetitive. It's basically like a 2-bar phrase, 2-bar phrase, 2-bar phrase, 2-bar phrase, with a slight variation at the end, a very slight. And this is why I picked this version, because it's basically, there's nothing changed about the drum beat of this until the very last measure, and the change is minute. If you're not paying attention, the drummer, every time there's an 8-bar phrase, he changes it just ever so slightly, just to give us this idea that that's the end of the 8-bar phrase, right? So we can break things up. So if this is the section, we break it up into phrases. So phrases are sort of like repeating sections. So you see there's like 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, and a fourth one, which is slightly different, right? We can further break that down into motifs. Okay, so within phrase, you have motif 1 and motif 2. So there's sort of this like contrasting thing. Okay, so a motif is basically like a collection, and these are actually, interestingly enough, these are all words that he used as well in his email to me. Phrase, motif. I think he was kind of throwing out a lot of things, but these are words you might use to describe this section. So there's the motif, and then we break it down even further. So from motif we have cells. Okay, so cells, and you could parse this a number of different ways, but I'm going to call this a cell. It's just these are like sort of the building blocks of the motif. So you pull it apart and you say, okay, so we have the kick and snare pattern, right? And then we have the hi-hat pattern, okay? So those are the two different cells. And then you have specific, beyond that, you're really getting down into the elemental level of what the music is. So because it repeats so much, so regularly, these have a lot of meaning. They make us, bop our head to things like this. But if you go further than that, you're really just talking about like one specific. I hesitate to call it an eighth note because I'm in England, but eighth note. Maybe you'll translate for me. But yes, so I mean, one specific element of this would just be the eighth note, right? So if we get down to there, or like a quarter note, crotchet, right? Okay, good. So this is, a note by itself, devoid of any other, context, really doesn't mean that much, right? But in the context of this, it actually means a whole lot if it comes at the end of this section, right? So there's a ton of meaning that happens there. This gets me to the work of John Roeder, who came up with these ideas of accent categories, okay? Accent categories, so we're used to the ideas of, just sort of changing the dynamics of a specific tone to accentuate a certain pitch or a certain rhythm above other things. So this is I've always found this extremely useful. So he has, he gets this from the study of Steve Reich. The idea of things having an accent even if they're not changing dynamically. So it's a confluence of multiple different streams, like pitch and dynamics, or pitch and harmony, pitch and timbre, or something like that. So that's how it gets these accents. And this is important if you want to teach a machine to understand the music in the same way that we do, because this is it's very much how we hear music, why certain things are meaningful. So if I go back to this, like, why is this one beat at the end of this phrase so important? And it's timbrally important because when you open the hi-hat, it's actually a different timbre. It rings, so it's a durational importance. And also, it's the first time we've heard that the first time we've heard this in the very repetitive structure that we've been listening to so far. So basically, that one note, even though it's really out of context, it's just that, it's actually filled with a ton of meaning, right? So this got me to thinking, how would I actually, use this, and this is something I do a lot in machine learning and performance. We say, how do we get the machine to understand this thing? So we build a lot of these sort of ideas into the app. I came up with this sort of paradigm for how you would combine this, the idea of and much of this is something that Avatar already does, but through writing this paper, came to me that we should unify this with the John Rotor things. And I need to move on and get back to morphones. So then what then is the use for the idea of morphones? Because it really just seems like, well, what he's really saying is morphones can be any of these things. And maybe in that sense, it's really kind of a, like I said, it's a dodge. But this got me to thinking about, if you look at morphones, if you look at this entire scenario backwards, you're actually, everything can be a morphone. And the reason you should call it a morphone rather than a cell is because you don't know whether that little chunk is going to be a cell or whether it's going to be a phrase or a motif, right? And that's exactly how Dynascore is using these things. I wish we could have actually heard this, but that's how Dynascore is actually using them. It's using them in a generative fashion to drive the music and the musical choices and how you put things together. You could actually then create a template. Oh, I don't have that slide up there. You could create a template for how to put these things together. So let's say you input a number of pitches in a collection, and then you say the template, you have a number of melodic contours, like up and then down and then up and down, or down and up and down, flat. So all you would need is then to say, I need the input of the pitches that we use, and then put them in this melodic contour and spit out, choose one of those at random or based on some kind of context, and then spit out the melodic contour that you need. That becomes a cell, or it becomes a phrase, becomes a motif, becomes an entire piece, whatever it is, depending on how much stuff you need. So in short, basically, I think the term has some legs, but really less in an analytical sense and more in a generative sense. So time for questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. So, got about 2 minutes or so. Questions for that?
Sure. Semiotics.
So he said it tonight.
Museum?
Museum, so he took the chunk, I guess, lexeme from linguistics, and he puts together it's like a socio-semiotic theory, because it does basically what you just described, that combines a kind of social meaning with musical elements. So he defines a museum as the minimal unit of musical meaning, which exactly as you described can be varying lengths depending on its kind of function, meaningfulness.
Yes.
And so he didn't make any software. But I just wonder if there's some kind of semiotic explanation which might help you to kind of explain how these things can be differentiated between that doesn't necessarily lend itself to programming, but is perhaps more familiar in that kind of music analytical context. So there just seems to be like a really strong parallel there between your description and that theory.
Thank you. That's not something I hadn't encountered that work. For me, it really it reminded me a lot of Lerdahl and Jackendoff. There's a lot of these kinds of things, but Lerdahl and Jackendoff, and I'm not a linguist, so and I'm also not, music theory is not what I'm steeped in every single day. I'm a computer programming musician. So thank you for bringing that up. There probably is some connection. The one thing I had done was I investigated the sort of the CVs of some of the developers to see where they were coming from, and there's only one of them who has sort of a linguistic basis, and it's not particularly strong. So it's like he studied it a bit as an undergrad or something. So it's possible there's more you know, as I was looking at this, I thought, wow, there's really nothing about this term, you know. So I don't know. Maybe that's the next paper. You know, we'll see. We'll compare the two. Let's see.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's all the time we've got for Jason. Thank you. So, our next speaker is Stefano Catena, and Stefano is an Italian composer and researcher, and Stefano's paper is called Concepts and Approaches in Analyzing Spatial Gestures, a Link Between Mozart and Acousmatic Music. Stefano, thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Dave, for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And this presentation is an overview of the early stages of my Midlands for City funded PhD project called The Language of Music in Space, a study of listeners' perception to develop a new vocabulary of sound movements that I'm undertaking at the Montfort University with Dr. Batchelor and Professor Landy. I will introduce concepts regarding space and spatiality in the compositional practice, the idea of a spatial sonorous object as a basic unit for music analysis, its link to gestures and sound movement, a case study on Mozart's K286 Notturno for 4 orchestras, and how this concept can be used for spatial analysis and approaches for linking spatial movements from instrumental to acousmatic music and vice versa. The space and sound location have always been considered in musical practice by composers and art practitioners. Even the choice of performance spaces will have an impact on the musical result of a given piece, and some composition will work better or worse than others in particular spaces. However, space has taken its true place as a compositional parameter much later in music history than, for example, pitch, rhythm, or timbre, and is still being much discussed today. The first works in which space is used actively as a musical parameter date back from between the 10th and 15th century with vocal music, particularly with antiphonal psalms. The direct descendants of antiphonal psalms is the so-called polychoral style, where 2 or more choirs are actively used, also called cori battenti or cori spezzati, broken choirs. This compositional school was born in Venice in the 14th and 15th centuries, and its music was primarily performed in St. Mark's Church, with composers like Villaert and Andrea Giovanni Gabrieli. Later on, in the classical and romantic period, when the orchestra role became more prominent, composers tried to exploit the spatial location of small instrumental groups in order to create spatial movement and effects. One of these examples is Mozart's Notturno in D major, K286. Anyway, apart from these examples, spatiality was not very often used. Most of the time, composers were much more interested in exploring other musical factors, such as harmonic relations or timbre effects, leaving composer specialization outside of the common practice. Towards the end of the 19th century, composers like Mahler and Ives wrote works to further explore spatiality as a musical parameter. However, it was only after the Second World War that space was integrated more comprehensively into the compositional practice. Several composers used spatiality in creative ways, with or without the help of electronic medium. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen integrated the space in his serialistic practice, for example with Gruppen or Carré. Other works from Yanis Xenakis, or the very large repertoire of spatial music from Henry Brandt, Murray Schafer, or Alvin Curran. On the other hand, in the electroacoustic domain, spatiality and specialization have been explored and exploited much more deeply, also thanks to the introduction of the loudspeaker. Both in Paris with Musique Concrète and in Cologne with the Elektronische Musik, specialization has been considered a compositional parameter and explored as such. For example, with Pierre Henry's Potentiometer d'Espace or Stockhausen multi-channel piece, Gesang der Jünglinge. Many more examples of spatial experimentation in the electroacoustic and acousmatic domain were produced, from Xenakis' Brussels Pavilion and Concrete PH to François Bayle Acousmonium and Acousmatic Diffusion, or from Stockhausen Octophonie to Chowning's Illusion of Moving Sources. Along with the new technology for spatialization and diffusion of sound, the new theories about spatiality emerged, particularly those regarding the spatial morphology. With this term, we intend the spatial properties and spatial changes in sound, modifying and altering the sonic experience. In the case of acousmatic and electroacoustic music, the terms spatial morphology and spectral morphology are closely related and influence each other continuously. So in musical research, the concept of gesture is inevitably linked with movement and motion. This is because many musical activities involve physical movements that carry their implicit significance with them. It is the relation between motion and its meaning that constitute the foundation of a gesture. However, the concept of gesture can be complicated and sometimes even confusing. In a musical context, for example, the term gesture can imply body movements made by a musician, but also receptive movements made by the listeners or motions that are intrinsic in the music. An alternative notion in the musical domain can be provided with the definition of spatial event or spatial sonorous object. One can define a spatial sonorous object as any coherent and continuous sound movement that retains a musical function and that can be identified together with its sounding parameters. This definition will inevitably exclude certain spatialization techniques from such analysis. Point source techniques, for example, cannot be described with this approach, as no coherent and continuous sound movement is present. Together with its musical function and its movement in a listening space, the spatial sonorous object is described by the spectral morphology of the sound or sounds it is based upon. Sound and space are intertwined irreversibly. For example, whenever sound is recorded, the space where the sound happens is recorded as well, inevitably being linked with inevitably being perceived with the spectral properties of the source. In order to analyze musical spatial events, this concept needs to be taken into consideration. The sounding properties of the studied sound movements must be examined in conjunction with its spatial movement in order to fully understand their musical function. The relevance of the sounding properties can be attributed to Landy's something to hold on to factor. This concept regards the significance of a given musical aspect to the listener, and it was intended for composers to be aware of the need of inexperienced listener to have navigational tools. Even though it was originally introduced as a strategy to better understand timbre composition, I believe that its usefulness can also spill into the topic of music analysis. Some categories of features that a listener might hold on to can be relevant and be paired and analyzed together with the spatial movement of the work. This process of identifying pertinent factors to analyze space with can be called coupling. The terms coupling and decoupling are borrowed from electronics and telecommunication, but I shall refer to them as a symbolic attachment or detachment of a sounding parameter to their spatial motion. Mozart's Notturno in D major K286 is an interesting composition to be considered for spatial analysis. It is a classical tonal piece of music composed in Salzburg in 1777. Its peculiarity comes from the intention of the composer to exploit the spatial location of 4 orchestral groups in order to create the illusion of an echo. These orchestral groups are identical: 2 violins, a viola, bassi, and horns. And while their position are not clearly stated in the score, their name reflects their musical intent. Except from the first orchestra that can be identified as primary, the rest are called echoes, as if they were a literal duplication of the primary group and are numbered incrementally in the score. However, in one performance of the work reviewed by the Time magazine, Orchestra 1 was placed on the stage, Orchestra 2 and 3 on both sides of the stage, and Orchestra 4 almost out of sight in order to create the illusion of a distance. To better recreate this distant effect, strings from Orchestra 2, 3, and 4 would use mutes. The use of mutes was not a direct indication from the composer, but the reduction in volume and the progressive change in timbre would clearly enhance its sonic spatial experience. This interpretation will not be considered in the analysis, but its peculiar use of space and tone-altering devices is thought-provoking. So while the formal structure and style of the piece is quite canonical, the use of the spatial component in conjunction with tonal harmony, melodic phrasing, and orchestration defines the organization of the piece. The Notturno is divided in 3 parts: Andante, Allegretto grazioso, and Menuetto con trio. Only the trio, which is performed by the primary group alone, does not involve all the 4 orchestras. The work is a typically 18th century tonal piece. following the traditional harmonic rules of classical period. The orchestration is conventional as well, with violins generally performing the main melody, violas and bassi accompanying with occasional doublings, and the horns reinforcing the harmony and rhythm. Mozart moves sound between the groups similarly to an echo effect, where the phrase from the primary group is repeated equally or shortened. The repeated echo always contains a part of the original phrase. Analyzing the first phrase demonstrates that the use of the spatial component that is predominant throughout the whole piece. The main musical idea is stated in the 4 bars by Orchestra 1 and is repeated almost identically by Orchestra 2. And the only difference is represented by the pause on the first beat in bar 4, with the horns that follow the harmonic resolution together with the strings. On the other hand, the first violin in Orchestra 2, which plays the main theme, remains the same, acting as a link between the two orchestral groups. Mozart differentiates the spaces and by linking them with a single note, in this case a dominant, highlighting the tonal relationship in the material. In Mozart's Notturno, a spatial sonorous object can be identified anytime there is a continuous and coherent transition from one orchestral group to the other. But what are the where each orchestral group contains the same thematic and harmonic material. But what are the other aspects to consider? The spatial component, so the movement between the orchestra and their linking process, the tonal harmony, and the echoing rhythm that shortens the material gradually. These 3 components make up the spatial sonorous object. In Mozart's example, despite the continuous evolution of the music in terms of pitch, rhythm, timbre, and harmony, etc., whenever there is a spatial movement between the groups, no new material is introduced, shifting the listener's focus to the motion and highlighting what to hold on to. This interaction, balanced by the composer, is the focus point of the whole work. Mozart's Notturno contains 2 prevalent spatial sonorous objects that are used throughout the whole work, both inspired by real acoustic phenomena, echo and reverb. The echo effect is the most used one. The main material, melodic and harmonic, is introduced by the first orchestra, repeated faithfully or shortened by the groups, one after the other, giving the impression of a call response performed in different spaces. There is little or no overlapping between the orchestras, so they may sound as a single repetition of the echoing material. For instance, the opening theme is played by Orchestra 1 and lasts 4 bars in this case. At bar 4, the second orchestra intervenes while playing almost the same theme, only with a small variation at its beginning. The true difference starts when in Orchestra 3, the material is being shortened, diminishing from 4 to 3 bars. Similarly, Orchestra 4 plays only 2 bars, closing the opening theme. The manipulation of the material, in conjunction with the spatial location of the groups, results in a spatial accelerando or allontanando, where the sound echoes faster in each orchestra before disappearing. In this case, we hold on to not just the spatial manipulation of sound, but also to the harmonic and thematic material that is comprising the movement. By moving the material content in space, we can better appreciate both the spatial motion and the actual phrases and themes being performed. The reverb effect is mostly used in cadenzas, in ending section, and is strongly related in closing 5/1 harmonic resolutions. In this case, the term reverb is not used in a literal scientific way, but it only refers to the much closer distancing between the single echoes. This movement is like the echo effect, but in this case, there is a considerable overlapping of the orchestral groups, creating a shorter and faster decay of the original sound. Furthermore, no shortening of the material is present. For instance, the ending of the first section of the andantino is denoted by the repeat sign, which is shown there. The last spatial movement is indeed a reverb effect, and its whole duration is just 4 bars, where each orchestral group has 2-bar part to play, indicating how much they overlap. In this case, there is no real theme, so the spatial object relates much more to the harmonic and rhythmic content rather than to its melodic phrasing. We can therefore affirm that we hold on to the spatial motion, rhythmic and harmonic articulation in order to identify the spatial sonorous object. So these 2 motions represent the archetypes of the spatial sonorous object used by Mozart. Their implementation in the score is generally always similar throughout the work, and so is their structural role. So after classifying spatial sonorous objects in Mozart's work together with their identities and their role in the musical structure, several core questions are raised in relation to the use of this information in future works, particularly in acousmatic music. Are instrumental and acousmatic spatial movements comparable and interchangeable? Can they be abstracted and analyzed only based on their intrinsic parameters? Can the technological and aesthetical differences between styles pose a challenge in this process? The concrete difference between instrumental and acousmatic spatial movements is that while in the first case the sound-producing gesture is visible or recognizable, defined by Smalley as a second-order surrogacy, in the latter case it's not always so. It's always by Smalley the third-order or remote surrogacy. This means that in the first case, if a recorded sound is heard, one can be sure of its origin and reliably visualize the producing gesture. In the case of acousmatic music, this is not always true, due to the multifaceted manipulation of the sound that is intrinsic in the musical style, and where the gesture can be implicit or imagined. If a spatial movement were to be analyzed without considering this difference, then they could be identified by their common parameters and their evolution in time: pitch, timbre orchestration, rhythm, dynamics, and in the specific case, spatiality. It can be said that by abstracting the spatial object from their underlying and incomparable features, one can analyze the considered movement similarly, regardless of the origin of the sound. For example, an echoing movement found in Mozart's Notturno could be applied to the spatial movement of sound masses in acousmatic music by isolating the space parameter from pitch, timbre, rhythm, and so on. A concrete example can be Normando Le Renard de la Rose, where the composer largely uses rhythmic and echoing material. Translating Mozart's spatial gesture onto Normandou's work will provide a new and unique interpretation of the acousmatic opera. This process of abstraction from the sounding parameters is the reverse process observed in the analysis stage and can be consequently called decoupling. It can be applied to every considered piece, being necessary in order to isolate the spatial morphology from spectral morphology. As noted, many fundamental parameters of the considered movements are discarded, such as tonal harmony or instrumentation, but the abstracted spatial motion and its potential structural role would be still valid both in the instrumental and acousmatic domain. Considering spatial aspect, depending on where the composition are performed, a very different sonic experience will result both from acousmatic and instrumental music. However, many historical pieces from the history of acousmatic and electroacoustic music were produced only in stereo. Their true spatial interpretation would happen at the concert halls, with design and specialized systems such as acousmoniums. With the creation of new specialization techniques such as ambisonics and always increasing computing capability, today it is possible to precisely recreate specific spatial motions, gestures, and entire composition within almost any surround speaker setup, with acceptable results. These technological advancements are not a barrier at all, but instead a bridge that allows the acousmatic composer to position sound in space just as they desire. And in this regard, it is possible to translate spatial movements from instrumental music to acousmatic composition. Instrumental music might not always be the starting point of these spatial processes. So some movements could be transported from acousmatic to instrumental domain, or even adapted in piece coming from the same macro category. In this case, only the instrumental to acousmatic approach is firstly investigated. However, it can be interesting to consider the problematics in other techniques, as it is more complicated to spatialize sound in the instrumental realm. Decoupling of the sounding parameters from the spatial morphology in acousmatic music would remain, as it would in the previously considered instrumental music, but the examination of the sounding parameters would be completely different in the first case. So while this is only the first stage of my PhD project, it would be useful in establishing a framework for the analysis of spatiality and the categorization of spatial movements. Such framework can be used for the analysis of several pieces of music, using the spatial sonorous object as a basic unit for the identification and interpretation in the musical context of the spatial motions. the idea of analyzing and translating spatial movements from the traditional instrumental to the acousmatic domain and vice versa can be a powerful tool to spatially organize a piece and a new way to enlarge the vocabulary of spatial expressions used both in the considered worlds. In this way, a multitude of approaches to spatialization can be used creatively rather than exclusively. The Mozart analysis has provided two different spatial archetypes that can be exploited creatively in a different domain. This is possible with a coupling-decoupling process. Further works will use this approach to create listening tests to study the reception of the categorized movements. And this study will be then used in order to generate a new vocabulary of spatial motions in creative environments. Thank you very much for.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Stefano?
Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. Thoughtful stuff. Yeah.
Thanks.
It just reminds me of Boulez's name keeps coming up. His pieces. Do you know the piece Domaine, or there's the Dialogue de l'Entre-Double for violin electronics, or even his piece Memorial, which he uses. Just when he said it, he uses almost the same forces. It's two violins, viola, and cello with practice beats on and two French horns.
Yeah.
With a solo flute.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is there any connection with because what the ensemble does in Memorial, often it acts like a reverb. It holds on notes that the flute. So I'm just wondering if is there a sort of genealogy between the kinds of primary research, let's call it, Mozart's doing there, and later composers.
Yeah, I think it's there are some connections between what Mozart did and then what happened mostly after the Second World War. Yeah. So you're talking about Boulez, but for example, Stockhausen did something very similar with Gruppen, for example, which clearly is a completely different music style, but still. He does that kind of continuous movements between orchestras, and I'm not familiar with the work you mentioned, so I couldn't say more about it.
It might be worth just having comparing it with the Mozart. I say it just struck me. It's almost the same band as Mozart's using.
Yeah,
I think that's all. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just, I mean, you also think, the two horns, there's all that stuff, the echoes of the horns across the fields.
So much in common that I didn't even think of. And because he's trying to build up this timeline, the fact that you have this kind of continuity, where Boulez has the knowledge of acousmatic music.
Mozart didn't.
Fantastic suggestion.
Yeah. Thank you.
Will you check the Teams chat? I think somebody's trying to.
Should I?
The Teams chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear David.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
I don't think anyone else can hear him, but I can from somewhere.
Well, maybe you can repeat the question, or.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to hear actually.
Try again.
Yeah, try again.
Hello.
Yeah, I can hear, and then I'll repeat the question.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for that paper. I found that really, really interesting. I guess my question relates to acousmatic works that specifically use traditional sort of instrumental music, maybe more note-based tonal elements within it that are maybe less transformed, etc., where the instrumental music is quite obvious. It seems that when it comes to the sound diffusion of that sort of acousmatic music, or those moments within acousmatic music, those sorts of sounds we sort of tended to be considered as somehow being incompatible with spatial articulation, or somehow that spatial articulations that we might apply to other parts of the piece or other sorts of sounds just do not lend themselves well to, the instrumental sound. So, I mean, it's just interesting that this perspective that you raise in a way sort of challenges that bias a little bit. Do you think that it can kind of bring new insights in terms of how we diffuse pieces in performance that use those sorts of sounds?
Okay, so just to reiterate the question, you're asking if in sound diffusion, some sounds that are what you call non-compatible with sound diffusion. If I'm actually challenging that view of that, well, that's an interesting question. I am challenging the view that I don't think there are sounds that cannot be diffused. I'm more coming from a composed space rather than a performed space, if you know what I mean. In this case, Mozart is very precise in saying what goes where. So he does have the precise control over the timbre and orchestration and every note that goes in space, and how he spatializes that as well it's very precise. So he has that control. In sound diffusion, well, I'm not really sure that I can answer the question, because coming from the composed space and going into composed space, this deals mostly with that. So, for example, I know I mentioned acousmoniums, but the work that I will be doing and I'm doing, it doesn't really concern the diffusion of sound in terms of projection, like the classical acousmatic interpretations, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to draw that one to a close, but that's really interesting stuff. Lots more to discuss later. Thank you very much. Setting up to do now. So our final speaker for this paper session is John Dack. I've known John for quite a few years now, haven't I? One way or another, meeting up at conferences. And I will let John introduce his talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I apologise for the lateness of this whole session, really. It was all my fault, of course. Last night I got the dreaded error 56 or something, Microsoft, and my PowerPoint wouldn't function, so Mark's kindly transferred it all across to his. Yeah, my papers concerns the notion of the open form and the traditional ways of analysing, both from the score and from performances. So let me start. The use of open or variable forms has preoccupied many artists since the beginnings of the 20th century. The concept of the open work and open forms and open works are not the same thing, of course, challenges the single trajectory of the artwork and the notion of organic unity. It represents perhaps one of the major paradigmatic shifts from late Romanticism to modernism. The use of such forms in music can be identified in the works of composers in the immediate post-war years. Particularly celebrated examples include the Troisième Sonate, or Third Sonata by Pierre Boulez, the electroacoustic work Scambi by Pierre by Henri Pousseur. I've done a lot of work on Scambi, but I'm leaving that to one side for today. And Klavier Elf by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. However, the use of the term open disguises many underlying differences in approach and aesthetic attitudes. It could be argued that there are many types of open form, each with its own inherent potential and tendency for development. In order to contextualize the subject of this particular talk, I will place the open form in some kind of historical context and discuss connections briefly with other art forms. I'm shared between music and fine art where I teach. In fact, I don't teach very much in the music department anymore. I do much more in fine art. There's a long story there which I won't bore you with. So therefore, I tend to, as much as possible, look at concepts that appear in music, because I'm a musicologist, and see how they can be interpreted within a fine art context, such as serial art, and there is serial art, and open forms in artworks as well. I'm also going to be looking at briefly identifying the notion of openness in works of literature, such as Le Livre by Mallarmé, who was an important influence for some Boulez, and the Son Mimiade, the poem by Raymond Queneau. So I have perhaps an unhealthy and even anally retentive interest in open forms. I'm fascinated by the problems of mobility within larger formal structures, as well as the problems they have for contemporary performance practices, and indeed the aesthetic appreciation of these works. As a musicologist, I'm also interested in analysis. This might sound like an obvious point, but I have colleagues who are quite adamant that they are analysts. They're not musicologists. They make a clear distinction between historical musicology and analysis. Open forms, therefore, do raise, for me, interesting analytical questions that can be related to the contemporary turn towards performance practice in music studies. It's a well-known fact that for decades, centuries even, the principal source for information about the composition can be derived from an intense study of the score. Now, I'm as guilty of doing this as anyone, and in many ways I don't apologise for it. Much important information can be learnt from scores, as the analyst often realises a performance, an imagined performance, whilst reading the score. Today, performers are, quite rightly, rather more assertive than they have been previously, and demand that their voices are heard. I'm married to a Juilliard-trained pianist, and she's quite adamant that performers have something to say, and they should be heard, and they should be recognised for saying that. I'm convinced there is a means of combining these two approaches from an analytical point of view, of reading the score, the traditional approach, and doing a performance analysis, an analysis of natural performance. Now, in my opinion, these problems become particularly acute in open forms. How do we approach the analysis of an open form? By definition, there's an infinite number of possible realizations. There are, of course, an infinite number of possible realizations of, for example, Beethoven's Hammerklavier, though here the form is, of course, closed. I'll go into that more later. My presentation will therefore suggest that the scrupulous analysis of the score is not without value in the traditional sense. To casually dismiss a composition as an open form work without investigating the structural levels at which the openness operates is, I think, musically and, dare I say, intellectually lazy. But I would suggest it's often not done. Now, according to de Liège, Célestin de Liège, this is a translation from his book, the very thick book that some of you might know by de Liège. He does talk about the open forms, and he says, as you can see, we can discover, it seems, three main sources which are responsible for the different states of what we shall call, to all intents and purposes, the open work. He calls it open work rather than open form. Cage's aleatoric models, the statistic nature of serial composition, and certain literary projects, the most important of which, and the most referred to, is found in Mallarmé. Oh, that's in French, in case you want to check my translation. This is the a passage from by Boulez. Boulez also talks about the fragmentary nature of contemporary composition, and of course he was very influenced by visual art. And we know his comments about Paul Klee, and indeed this is from a book that he wrote on Paul Klee. He talks about this, the work as a spiral or mosaic, especially true of music, which is the art of the fragment. Of course, fragment crops up in many contemporary philosophers, such as Adorno. Indeed, perception of a musical work which unfolds in time is necessarily partial, whereas with painting you have a total perception of it immediately. This fundamental difference seems to me to be the reason why contemporary music remains more difficult than contemporary painting for the general public to grasp. I put this in because I would take, dare I say, issue with Stockhausen. I don't think a lot of paintings are grasped immediately or easily. I would defy, in many ways, anyone to stand in front of a painting such as those large, huge canvases in the Tate Modern by Rothko and get them immediately. I think you have to sit there or stand there and just look, and it takes time. So I take issue a bit with Boulez at that point. However, the open or variable forms allow, or one might even say demand, the active collaboration of performers within a more or less strict limitations demanded by the composer. The concept of open can, of course, be interpreted in a number of ways. The term open form is now widespread in the English-speaking music community, where it's often synonymous with mobile forms. The term mobile, in turn, invites comparisons with the sculptor Alexander Calder and his mobiles. Again, this is with my fine art hat on. These mobiles not only change according to the viewer's perspective, they also change as they move in air currents when placed in galleries. While this is an interesting development in the fine arts, it is, in my view, always obvious to the viewer that there is one artwork, even though its constituent elements are constantly shifting in relation to each other. It is not too much of an exaggeration to claim that the principal interest in such work is the continuous shift of position, the obvious movement of the elements in relation to one another, rather than discrete and intentional reconfiguration of individual parts. There is no deliberate, if you like, intervention by somebody outside, unless we're going to claim that nature, air movement, is intervening. And that's what interests me, the deliberate, intentional collaboration by somebody else, and not just the accidental collaboration by, say, air movements in Calder's mobiles. Moreover, it is according to David Roby, David Roby wrote the introduction to Umberto Eco's work, the translation of the open work. He says, it's entirely consistent with with Umberto Eco's view of aleatory music. He says, openness anticipates two of the major themes of contemporary literary theory. These are an insistence on multiplicity and the role of the reader and interpretation. The open work, he continues, is radically different from traditional works. It is a work in motion. In literature, therefore, it is not surprising that Eco cites James Joyce as a writer whose works can be described as open. Though this uncontroversial statement must still be examined carefully. Eco cites passages from Ulysses and Joyce's entire work, Finnegan's Wake, as examples. In the latter, Finnegan's Wake, he claims, I quote, "The opening word on the first page is the same as the closing word on the last page of the novel. Thus, the work is finite in one sense, but in another sense, it is unlimited." Again, I have to take issue with Umberto Eco. In my version of Finnegan's Wake, that simply isn't the case. The very last sentence doesn't end with a full stop, that's true. But when you go to the beginning of Finnegan's Wake, the very first word has no capital. Therefore, you can see that the novel can, or the book, can revolve around itself, but they're not the same words. I'm not quite sure where Eco gets that information from. It's possible there are different editions of Finnegan's Wake. I'm willing to believe that. Open in this context, therefore, means that the constituent elements of the novel or poem cannot be changed, but the form in which they are presented is so unusual or ambiguous that the reader has no choice but to allow or submit to a number of different, perhaps very different, interpretations. Such an innovative approach to literature is naturally a defining feature of modernism. There are, however, other versions of open works that are more relevant to the present discussion. These are works where there is an explicit invitation by the author to rearrange the order of individual parts. As far as I'm aware, Joyce never suggested the chapters of Ulysses could be read in any order. And in fact, it would be ridiculous because it, of course, follows the progress of one day. Was it June 16th? I can't quite remember. That was Bloomsday, I believe. One example of this is a work by Mallarmé. Mallarmé intended to write a book called Le Livre. Oh, sorry, that's bullet. Le Livre. It was intended to be printed not in standard book format, but on loose pages. There was therefore the possibility of many different readings that would result from new configurations of the individual sections. Naturally, in each of these many different readings, words and phrases would cluster around in patterns not envisaged by Mallarmé. They would coalesce in what he called constellations, and they would take on the life of their own. It's again significant, perhaps, that Mallarmé's term constellation is one frequently used by contemporary composers and philosophers. Adorno's name cropped up again. This work is even more astonishing when we consider that Mallarmé died in 1897. Thus, the work predates the use of openness in 20th century literature by several years. A last example, another literary open work, and a more modern one, is the Cent Milliards de Poèmes by the writer-mathematician Raymond Queneau. The number to which Raymond Queneau refers is 100,000 billion poems, milliard in French, billion, which is 1,000 million. So it's one with 14 noughts after it. It's a long number. Queneau favours the Petrarchan division in 4-4-3-3 lines of the sonnets, the standard 14-line sonnets that he used, rather than the Shakespearean 12 and 2 subdivisions. Each page is divided into separate horizontal strips with one line printed on each. The inspirations, according to Queneau, were children's books where characters are illustrated on pages. Where the head of one strip could be combined with the torso of another. I actually brought my copy along. It's easy to explain it here, and you can see it's that. So you can mix any of these poems up, but you've always, first line is always line 1. The second line is always line 2. Nevertheless, according to Queneau in the preface, he says that if you were to realise all of those, it would take you about 250,000 years to read them. And none of us has that much time. It's significant, perhaps, that Queneau was a member of Oulipo, the French literary group, the Workshop for Potential Literature, whose members were people like Calvino and Georges Perec. And they summarised their activities by the notions of freedom and constraint. That, again, interests me with regard to all of these questions in music. So, open works in music. It's clear, therefore, that the open works have existed in literature for decades. When we turn to music, the situation is somewhat different. The teleological direction of tonal music, for example, would seem to prohibit such openness. The prevalence of open works in the post-war period is thus all the more interesting. There is, in addition, doubtless a link with serial thought. That's an all-pervading post-war development. Indeed, Eco goes so far as to write, and I quote, "This hypothesis of an oriented production of open possibilities, of an incitement to experience choice, of a constant questioning of any established grammar, is the very basis of any theory of the open work." End of quote. In music, as well as in every other artistic genre, these problems occur. The theory of the open work is none other than a poetics of serial thought. Naturally, Eco detects serial thought in all art forms other than music, though music is the most obvious application for the one I'm talking about. So, open forms have been investigated by numerous musicologists and analysts. For example, Konrad Burmer provides detailed and comprehensive discussion in his book Zur Theorie der offenen Formen der neuen Musik. I didn't know Konrad Burmer very well. I suspect Lee knew him much better than I did. But he was an incredibly generous man, I believe. And he's put the theory of the open work up on his website. I don't know who's managing that now. Now he's dead. But you can download it for free. And I think it's absolutely indispensable in terms of for an understanding from the 1960s of how we think about open forms. Another reference can be found in Christian Martin Schmidt's article, Die offene Frage der offenen Form. This is a diagram from Giesler, Walter Giesler's book, Composition in the 20th Century. Essentially, Giesler posits two pairs of categories in this place, local, global, and determined, indeterminate. Combining these pairs results in 4 quadrants, suggesting principal types of open forms, indicated by the numbers 2 and 3. That's what I've done there. Giesler uses the German terms variable form or variable form and mehrdeutige form, generally translated as multi-dimensional form. The former specifies a form that is fixed in its large global dimensions, but is indeterminate as far as the details of the constituent sections are concerned. This is number 2 in Giesler's diagram. The latter is the reverse. Its global form will not be established precisely in advance by the composer, but will result from the arrangement of its local sections, the details of which remain fixed. This is labeled number 3. Numerous cases of both types can be identified without difficulty. For example, the trajectory in Stockhausen's Cyclus, which I'm going to go into in a minute, for solo percussionists is fixed, though the starting point has been decided once the starting point has been decided by the performer. Indeed, this starting point and the progress through the score results from an even greater degree of openness than merely establishing where to begin, as they will be influenced by which way round the spiral bound score is read. However, once a starting point has been decided, the player has no choice but to progress from one page to another in a fixed linear sequence until the same initiating event has been reached once more. Once this point is reached, the performance concludes. But at practically every stage, decisions must be made at a local level from the choices offered by Stockhausen. This work therefore fits into Giesler's variable form and was indeed an example chosen by him in his book, along with Stockhausen's refrain, Berrioz's circles, Lutosławski's string quartet. By contrast, Stockhausen's Klavierstück 11 consists of short composed fragments which are fixed in certain details, but whose precise positions within the realization of the work as a whole is left to the performer. The overall form is therefore unpredictable. Some fragments are played once or twice, some perhaps not at all. Once a fragment has been played 3 times, the performance is finished. That's Stockhausen's decision. Thus, each small section retains its identity regarding pitch and relative note durations, but its position within the work must remain negotiable. Furthermore, even when sections are repeated, their tempo, dynamic level, and articulations will not be fixed. They will be determined by instructions that are written at the end of the preceding section. Such a work demonstrates that Stockhausen engages with openness in an intelligent, non-mechanistic manner. It is perhaps a paradox that such freedom is modified, if not abandoned entirely, by performers of work such as Klavierstück 11, who prepare in advance a version that they play regularly. In this case, the invitation to participate in the creation of an open form at the point of performance in an improvisatory manner is deferred, and understandably so, perhaps. I was told by a colleague of mine that Klavierstück 11, you'll probably know the actual, possibly the actual score itself is one single sheet on which there are these 19 fragments. And as a pianist, you sit down and your eye goes from one fragment to another and you play that particular fragment. It must be a real nightmare for a pianist to do that in an improvisatory manner. And a colleague of mine told me that Stockhausen's daughter actually prepares a score which is kind of defeating the point, not exactly defeating the point, but it goes against the grain slightly. She literally has prepared it in advance and she turns pages. That's Stockhausen's daughter. I assume her dad has given her permission to do that. But I then saw on YouTube not that long ago Pierre Laurent Aymar doing exactly the same thing. So I think in principle it was a wonderful idea by Stockhausen, but I just don't think that it's practical, to be honest with you. Other examples of these kind of scores are Pousseur's Mobile for 2 pianos and Halbenstock Romatis Jeu for 6 percussionists. So this is an example of Stockhausen's cyclus, and you can see that a perfunctory analysis of this work would not reveal a balance between openness and constraint. We know that the percussionist can start at any point in the score. Of course, I have the score. It's spiral bound. Any of these pages is page 1. You can, of course, turn it upside down and start there. Any of the pages, still page 1, but now you're going in a completely different direction. In this case, we can see what happens here. We've got the moments of tension and release, which I think are actually terribly important. In terms of an analysis of the actual performance, how does a percussionist, if they wish to have an element of tension and release, how do they actually achieve this? Here we can see that the timeline across there, thank you. The timeline is maintained by Stockhausen. You choose either that box or that box. However, when you get to here, you have to choose that something from that box or that box. There are all sorts of different ways of combining these different events, as it were. And then indeed the performer can, of course, decide to have moments of repose, moments of tension, moments of release. I would suggest that some pages, such as this one, you can't see it, I wanted to put it up on the screen, but of course my PowerPoint back. It's actually not very rich in terms of its potential for openness, because in fact you haven't got many choices. When you compare that with this, there's huge numbers of different options. Here, you've just simply got that, and then that, or down the other way, that, and then that. So Stockhausen has carefully composed a score where this notion of tension and release is possible. What we do know, though, is that if, and I've only labelled them as A, B, C, and D because, of course, the pages aren't numbered. If you choose to go in that order, A, B, C, D, E, then, of course, you could go start with A and start with I, J, A, B, C, D. It doesn't matter where you start. Or you could turn it upside down and do it in reverse order. All of those are perfectly possible. But, of course, we have to bear in mind that B will always be followed by C and preceded by A, unless it's the other way around, where B is preceded by C and then followed by A. So there are limits to Stockhausen's notion of openness, and I think that that's significant in any kind of analysis. An example, please, is my intention is to go through the various versions of cyclists that I have. This particular percussionist actually started on that page. It's not difficult to work it out. You just have to follow the instructions and gradually it will make sense. To see if there are elements that we could, that as a traditional, an analyst can regard as moments of tension and release, development, and all the rest of it. Which I haven't done yet, but that's my next. That's the next stage, as it were. In Klavierstück 11, the sections, as I've said, could be played in any order. They're not the same as as Tickless. They can be played in any order. And again, this is just a diagrammatic representation that I've made up. You can see here that this theoretical section 1, it's been played 3 times, that's it, the piece is finished. But it could be that you've got section 2 there and section 2 there. But of course, section 2 will be different depending on coming from section 8 or section 5. Because Stockhausen is absolutely scrupulous in his score. This is only a fragment of the score, I'm afraid. I did have the whole thing. I work at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama as well, as Middlesex University, and we bought the score, or they bought the score, back in the 1960s. It's been taken out 3 times, twice by me. And you can see here these indications here. That tells you how to play the next section. So if I go back and therefore, it could be that this section 2 will be much quicker, much louder, have different articulation, followed by section 5, followed by section 8. The degree of openness there is I think, interesting, and also, as I've said, one can hear. Again, I've followed this is David Tudor. I've got a pretty good idea of where he's going throughout the score. Simply because it seems, therefore, if all these fragments are being played one after another, it could be, as Bourles has talked about, the art of the fragment. In fact, again, Stockhausen, I'm a great admirer of Stockhausen, I have to say. There are some fragments where he uses the term binden, which means you connect one fragment to another. So, in fact, there is some continuity. Stockhausen has actually, I think, as a composer, thought through his material extremely well. So, just a few lines to finish. I would say that some years ago, a professor of aesthetics, I won't say where he taught, but actually it wasn't in the UK, said he thought these kind of pieces were trivial. And I found that an astonishing comment. He might not like the result, and many people would agree with him, but this period, one might say the golden period, the golden age of open works, 1950s, 1960s, illustrates moments of complexity and simplicity. The performer can, indeed must, negotiate between the levels of openness that I suggested. Thus, I believe the potential for open forms is still valid. And with the increasing popularity of things like video games and other forms of entertainment, an understanding of musical forms that cannot exist in a fixed state is even more necessary than ever. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. We're running a little bit behind schedule.
Yeah, sorry about
We've got maybe 1 or 2 brief questions for John.
Thank you for that fascinating paper. I had 2 thoughts. One is that I heard a story many years ago that David Tudor actually, came up with his own version, and Stockhausen didn't know, like that he planned out everything, as you mentioned, other people did. And the other thing was that in Zyklus, there's a visual element actually because it's a circle.
Yeah.
And so you get in the performance, you probably get some aspects of ups and downs just from watching that.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating piece to watch that way.
Yeah, I think it was Robin McConey who said that with Stockhausen's scores, he's able to express his compositional thinking through his scores in a way that's really quite remarkable. He comes up with a problem and solves it in writing out the score. And I've always admired that a great deal with Stockhausen. So I think that Zyklus and Clavier Stockhausen also do, they both do that. But certainly the performance problems of doing Clavier Stockhausen, where you're looking at one fragment and then you've got to follow the tempo as you leave one fragment to the next one, it must be an absolute nightmare. So I can see why people do prepare performance scores. That's not what Stockhausen wanted, but
Yeah.
yeah, as I say, I'm sure if he gave his daughter permission, that's great. And I'm sure he did. I'm sure she ran that past her dad. And I'm sure she said it was all right.
Great. We could talk for hours, but I think we're running out of time. So thank you to John. Also, thank you to Stefano and thank you to Jason.